I am pretty close to being tone deaf, and I might be the last person in America who ought to be sitting down and writing a book about jazz. On the other hand, I have been for my entire professional life a journalist, and journalists begin every day knowing very little about the story they're going to have to try to educate a public about at the end of that day. And what they do in between is talk to people who are smarter than they are, who educate them. And that is precisely what I did with this book. I interviewed people who were incredibly gracious and understanding at how little I knew. I interviewed people like Wynton Marsalis, the great trumpet player and jazz educator, John Batiste. I interviewed a guy who helped me understand the politics of jazz named Bill Clinton.
Hmm.
They were people who probably didn't care about me, but they cared that an author who was going to write a book for a substantial publisher on three people as important to them as Ellington, Armstrong, and Basie, they wanted to ensure that I got it right. And what I realized, the more research I did, was that while America didn't need me to tell them why Ellington, Armstrong, and Basie were musical geniuses, almost every book that had been written about them was written, understandably, about their life on the bandstand. And I was trying to write about exactly the opposite. I was trying to write about what these guys did when they weren't playing their instruments and performing in front of audiences, and how they moved the dial on the whole civil rights discussion in America.
Yeah.
They wrote the soundtrack for the civil rights revolution, and that was the story I was most interested in telling.
In sort of your humility in how you talk about your approach, and more broadly how you talk about the journalist's approach, it strikes me as this other sort of philosophical mindset I like to think about, which is the beginner's mind. You know, you said some of your background might make you the least likely person to write a book about these jazz figures, but I like to think of people in your position as being ideally suited because you can come in with the beginner's mind and ask questions that the experts might not ask, or that they might make assumptions about. And it's an advantage to come in without being overly immersed in the subject, but it's also daunting.
It is both, but that is a perfect way of saying it. It is a beginner's mind. That is what a journalist does in every story they write. That's what I do in every book I write. I try to write it so that people who don't have any background aren't intimidated by getting into the topic. And if you do that well enough, and if you've done your research well enough, you're also writing for the experts.
Yeah.
If you write just for the experts, you'll lose the beginners. But if you write for the beginners and you have something new as well as a simple story to tell, then you will bring in the experts.